I am Jeff Foxworthy, and welcome to Gamekeeper Podcast. If you want to learn more about farming for wildlife and habitat management, then, buddy, you are in the right place. Join the Gamekeeper crew direct from Mossy Oak Land Enhancement Studio as they discuss the latest wildlife and habitat management practices, news, and, of course, hunting. There's no telling what you'll learn, but I'm going to tell you, I bet it's interesting. Enjoy.
We're live in 3, 2, 1.
All right, everybody, here we are. Welcome to West Point, Mississippi, the Gamekeeper Studios. It is awfully hot outside right now, Lane.
It is heating up. Summer is kind of creeping in on us.
But I'm glad that I have a flannel shirt on.
Yeah.
To show off the companions line.
Well, it's kind of cool in here.
It is cold. It's freezing.
Yeah.
That's why you got shorts on.
Yeah.
So, Dudley, how is the Wangbone
the
turkey
development
call coming?
The development of
Well,
the Wangbone.
we're still talking about it and working on how we can make it happen, but it's going to happen.
I think we're going to have to get a bigger baculum.
Maybe so.
Well,
Don't you think?
Maybe we need a badger. It's a little bit bigger than a
walrus.
raccoon.
Walrus
Well,
has
walrus
the biggest.
has a baculum. You should start with the walrus.
That would be more like a elk.
bugle.
Yeah.
A Wangbone bugle.
Yeah.
Did y'all have anybody say anything to you about the show starting off last week with you talking about a baculum?
Was it last week?
Well, it was either last week or the week before.
Max said something to me. I'm kind of hard to find, you know.
Yeah.
You know how
are.
expensive.
Speaking of hard to find, where is the LS? I need the LS tractor.
Oh, did you want to use it?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know, but somehow it ended up back in my house again.
So you said, "Oh, I'll never use that small tractor with all those attachments," and
I've been, that is the handiest
And I can't find it.
No, this is one of the handiest tools I've put my hands on.
it's a
Put it that way.
strong little tractor.
It's a great little tractor, and you can get in and out of places really easily, and of course haul, dig. I mean, Richie finally brought it back, So I was just proud to get it. I was just keeping it at my house for safekeeping because what is it?
Mike has fact-checked a rather large baculum, I think.
All right.
You can get a 4.5 foot baculum for $8,000.
God, man. Those things
Is that even
expensive.
legal? I mean, can you buy an animal
That might be
part?
the most expensive elk call I've ever heard of.
I think you have to be 18 to purchase it.
Yeah. So let me say this: our guest today is probably going to want to share this podcast with maybe some of his colleagues,
Associates.
and we may be embarrassing him. And
This is a scientific discussion.
We talk about much weirder stuff, honestly. So this is fine.
well, let me go ahead and introduce. We
Absolutely.
have got this is guys. He's got the most interesting name, and then he's got just a fascinating job. But he could be, in contention for being the most interesting man in North America.
I hear him, yeah.
So Dr. Colter Chitwood.
Not big game doc, right?
His Instagram handle is @BigGameDoc. If I got that right.
That's right. Yep.
And he's like flying around, catching antelopes and chasing wolves in Alaska and
elk.
Elk.
And he's from North Georgia.
I mean, he's got the best. He's got it going on.
He really does.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to think so.
And I think he's working some fishing in all that too, from what I understand.
That's right. Yeah.
Colter, how do you get Chitwood? What kind of name is that?
A great question. I don't know. It pops up here and there. There was apparently a race car driver somewhere by that name, because that's the most common comment I get is they think I'm related to so-and-so Chitwood, who was I think he's actually like a stunt car driver, and like a, trick driver, whatever. But I don't know who that is, and I don't think I'm related to him. So I'm just a North Georgia hillbilly who managed to figure out how to go and chase and catch a bunch of animals for science.
Well,
Right.
so you're with
Game catcher.
Oklahoma State University, and then when you look at when you're reading his credentials, he's the correct me if I'm wrong now, but you're the assistant professor of natural resource ecology and management.
Yeah, that's our department name. Yeah.
Oh, so what's your title?
Well, assistant professor is kind of the academic speak for like your rank, so I'm a fairly new professor. I'm in my third year now at Oklahoma State. But my expertise is in big game ecology. So I do a lot of work on game species, especially things like white-tailed deer, wild turkey, elk, pronghorn, and do a lot of population ecology, and I do a lot of work in forested systems. So I actually took a position here that was a new position designed to focus on forested systems in Oklahoma. Because fun fact, Oklahoma is not just flat and windswept everywhere. About 28% of the state is forested. But for those of us in the southeast, like where I'm from in Georgia, there's trees everywhere. But in Oklahoma, of course, we transition out into the prairies pretty quick. So I do a little bit of everything when it comes to taxonomy, but almost always focused on game species.
You you look pretty young to be a doctor. Is this some kind of Doogie Howser thing going on here that you got started really young in life?
Yeah, I think that's what my parents and brother think. But yeah, I guess I paid my dues over the years, and I went to school quite a few years. So here we are.
Wow. Well, Oklahoma, Lanny, you've turkey hunted in Oklahoma.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of wildlife in Oklahoma.
Oklahoma's a great state to hunt in, no doubt. Duck hunting in Oklahoma.
Wild quail.
Yeah,
Yeah. You guys.
Got some pretty big whitetails there, Mr. Trophy Hunter, too.
Mm-hmm. I killed one in Oklahoma once.
I imagine that.
Yeah.
They had to call you in.
With a muzzle loader.
It was so tough, nobody else could do it. They had to call in the hired guns again.
Fun.
For folks that don't know about Oklahoma wildlife, I will say my big fun fact that was told to me as I was getting the position here, actually by Dwayne Elmore, who I believe y'all have had on the podcast before. If you could do it all in one day, you could start in southeast Oklahoma, extreme corner of southeast Oklahoma in McCurtain County, and you could be in a swamp that looks like South Georgia looking at an alligator. And if you could make it, beat tracks all day to the extreme northwestern tip of the panhandle, you're in mesa country with cholla cactus, elk, bighorn sheep, and pronghorn.
Man, I might have to take a vacation.
And blending right into New Mexico and Colorado. So it is an amazing state from a diversity standpoint, and is actually, I think I get it right, the third most diverse state behind only Texas and California. And if you exclude them, both of which are larger, you can exclude them because we're the most diverse state with no coastline. So, if you think about all the tornadoes you hear about, all those storm systems that come together over the southern Great Plains basically creates a massive precipitation gradient, which leads to a massive gradient of floral communities, which leads to a massive gradient of associated animal communities. So I had no idea. I'm, from Georgia. I lived in Missouri. I worked in Montana, and I ended up in Oklahoma. And just a really fascinating place to work, especially for folks like us that are into game species, because just about everything. I joked with somebody the other day, if only we had moose, I'd have just about everything here that I wanted to work on. I'll have to go north and west to get a moose project. But
wow. And they have a great musical that Dudley enjoys, Oklahoma, the musical.
Is there a musical called Oklahoma?
Won all kind of award. Anyway, let's keep on going. So
he looked that up
Colter
later.
got that.
Yeah, he looked that up later. It's a good one.
I only watch hunting shows on TV.
So before we get too far down in the weeds, Lanny, you're looking at me like, who is this episode brought to us by?
Bobby.
I was thinking the same
Who
thing.
is this episode brought to us
It's
by?
brought
That's
to
exactly what I was thinking.
Our friends at Nosler.
All right.
And I thought about, we're going to talk about pronghorns, and boy, a good bullet choice is very important when you're talking about shooting a long distance. And Nosler, I don't think anybody makes a better bullet than Nosler.
Yeah, the Nosler partition has been a part of the hunting heritage for a long time. We continue to innovate.
Accubon, ballistic tip.
Yeah, the ballistic tip is what they're so proud of right now.
Yeah.
Mac, have you shot any of those ballistic tips? They are unbelievably accurate.
He's still
And
thinking
they're
about
color
turkeys.
code.
I'll
30
order.
caliber is green. 270 is
270 is yellow.
Yeah.
So all 30 calibers are green?
Yep. And then 6.5, does anybody know what color that is?
The need more? It should be pink. It should be pink.
It's purple,
great.
I think.
Y'all are brutal.
The 6.5 is a great caliber.
Everybody needs more. I mean,
Yeah, we know. Well, anyway, so
I know 270 is yellow because my dad and I have shot those for years back in Georgia, and the green, the 308. My brother shoots a 308, and we've shot.
Now there's a caliber right there.
For years.
308.
Yeah, that is. So y'all go check out. Next time you're going to purchase ammo for a big game hunt, Nosler is the bullet.
No doubt about it.
All right, guys. So look, we're going to talk today. We've got Colter on here, and Richie, our esteemed producer, has spent some. We didn't need the horns for that, Richie.
He horned himself.
Yeah.
We can edit that out later.
I got to keep that.
We
in.
spent some time with Colter in Oklahoma capturing some pronghorn antelope. And Colter, could you tell us about this project and let's just open this up and start talking about it?
Yeah. Well, kind of starting at the 10,000 foot view, and I'll end up using acronyms. So as a scientist, I need to define all my terms. Okay. So I'm going to say ODWC quite a bit. That is the state wildlife agency in Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation. So ODWC is the funder of this project. It was initiated out of their need to learn more about the pronghorn in Oklahoma. And kind of long story short, over the last decade or so, there are various lines of evidence that they have, the surveys that they do annually from the air or via hunters were indicating potential population decline, likely or suspected to be driven by poor productivity. And so basically that's where the project came from. Our job at OSU, along with our partners, we're working with East Central University, which is a smaller school in Ada, Oklahoma, as well as Caesar Clayburgh Wildlife Research Institute, which is based at Texas A&M Kingsville. Those three institutions combined, we put forth a proposal to help ODWC address questions basically in two big prongs. Population demography, which is a fancy phrase for how are things living and dying, and is the population growing or declining and at what rate? And then on the other prong, because we're putting collars out, we can look at all kinds of questions related to how they're selecting resources, how they move about the landscape, and how changing landscapes, potential barriers might affect how they move, which might feed back on things like mortality and survival. So the two prongs can be kind of separate, but they're also related, and that's the shortest summary I think I can give on the project, but we can dive in wherever you want.
Well, I don't think when I think about antelope, I think of Wyoming, some other western states, but I didn't realize that Oklahoma had a huntable population out there.
Yeah, and that's actually a great point. If people are thinking about the range of pronghorn, I mean, a really unique species, endemic to North America, but they stretch from kind of the desert Southwest all the way into central Canada. So Oklahoma is situated in a pretty unique spot because we're about as far south as they go. There's some a little farther south out kind of New Mexico, Arizona, but we're also about as eastward as they go. You don't have to come too deep into Oklahoma, and from the west, like if you're driving out of New Mexico into our panhandle, once you come really through the panhandle and into the downstate part of Oklahoma, we don't really expect to see pronghorn anymore. So that also makes our project a bit unique because we're dealing with a native species right on the edge of its range. And nowadays with climate variability, potential changes associated with that, landscape changes, be it farming practices, energy extraction, renewables like putting in wind energy development, all of those things are kind of all happening in the core of the pronghorn range, but also on the fringes. And so on the fringes, we're interested in, well, does that cause a contraction or does the population continue to do well? And so though ODWC cares about pronghorn within their borders because that's where they control the hunting, we also recognize that we're on the edge of the range, and what's happening in Oklahoma could affect the Texas Panhandle, northeast New Mexico, southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas, because the pronghorn don't care about the boundaries, right? We do. But all of those states all come together right there where our project is occurring. And I will just, while I mention that, put in a plug. All of those states have been engaged with us over email and phone calls. They know the project is occurring. They've all been super helpful with any sort of plan for how we might follow up on a mortality if it occurred inside their state. So even though we catch all of our adults within Oklahoma lands, we've got relationships built with all these states because they're all really interested in the outcome of our project as well. Yeah.
I tell you, the antelope is a fascinating animal.
Absolutely. Speed goat, isn't that what they call them?
They do call them speed.
Yeah, it's like the only species we have that, in my opinion, that looks more like African plains game.
Well, that's the comparison that gets made, actually, the Africa comparison. But they're actually unique in the sense that we call them antelope, or we say pronghorn antelope, but they're not. They're not really. And so, again, that term endemic, well, it comes up quite a bit. But I'm always fascinated when endemic can mean really small areas. Like there's a butterfly that occurs only at what was known as Fort Bragg. I believe they've now changed the name to Fort Liberty, but where I did my PhD work years ago, that butterfly occurs nowhere else in the world.
Wow.
Except on that military base. So it's endemic to that military base. And so when I mentioned that earlier, and to your point, it looks like species that we would think about in Africa, but that actually also kind of makes it cool because it's the only thing we've got in North America that looks like that, and it doesn't occur on any other continent. So, yeah.
So they
Whatever you
evolved
wanna
on their
call it,
own to
speed
be
goat.
like that.
So it's a unique species. I mean, what's the closest thing it's related to?
Gosh, I'd have to think about my old charts, but it'd be closer to giraffes than some of the things you might think are close, like an elk.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. But so yeah, really fascinating, really
A
unique
speed giraffe,
physiology,
yeah.
And this,
and really fast. Yeah, fastest land animal in North America.
I know you're studying their population dynamics, and this may seem like a really basic question, but a couple 300 years ago, they were able to run around wherever they wanted to, and now we have barbed wire fences everywhere. I haven't really interacted with pronghorns much, but I remember when I was younger, in junior high, I was on a trip in Wyoming, and I watched a pronghorn just run into a fence repeatedly. And I know that sounds pretty tragic, but it just kept running into a fence and it died.
I've seen
So,
whitetails do that.
do fences everywhere? I mean, does that affect their movements, or do
Yeah,
they just know how to jump them?
Well, it's a little of both. I mean, the answer is there's quite a bit of emerging evidence that it does affect their movements. And I've even got a colleague who I worked with in Montana, and much of his dissertation was actually built around what he kind of dubbed fence ecology. And pronghorn were his main study species. And they will jump, and there's videos if you look around enough on Instagram and whatnot, but that's far more unique than them going under. So from a mitigation standpoint, a lot of what we're seeing now, if y'all have heard of wildlife friendly fencing, well, in particular, that can be really valuable for pronghorn because they're far more prone to go under that bottom strand. And so turning the bottom strand into smooth wire, or actually, and forgive me for forgetting the exact number of inches, but there's been some work done actually figuring out about what height we would want it at to where it's not going to affect you keeping your cattle in, but it'll allow the pronghorn to move more easily between pastures. So it's a big issue across the American West, and honestly, potentially one in Oklahoma. But again, this is the first time pronghorn of Oklahoma have been studied this intensely. So we don't know if something like that will emerge as important, but we suspect that landscape factors like roads and fencing could be affecting movement even in Oklahoma. Yeah.
So what have y'all learned in this study that has really surprised you about the antelope?
I tell you, that's a great question, and I'm going to jump right to my favorite answer right now. This might change over time if we revisit this in another year or two, because obviously we're pulling in data over many years here. We're in year 2 of 4 as far as the intensity of our data collection. But when we started this, and I'm not throwing anybody under the bus here, I won't say any names, whether they were some game wardens, some ODWC biologists, or even hunters that we had talked to, landowners. there was a lot of predictions about where the pronghorn that we tagged were going to go. And when I say tagged, I mean we catch them with the helicopter, put that collar around their neck, and there was conversations about, well, we think there's this little kind of subpopulation in this area, and we think they're probably going to bounce back and forth into Kansas, and then this group's going to bounce back and forth into Texas, and this group's for sure going to bounce back and forth into New Mexico. And I've said this to a bunch of people, so I'll say it again right now. If you handed me a map of the pronghorn points right now, the technicians and the students just printed it out, and here's a bunch of dots on a map, and I went and subbed in central North Carolina landscape behind there, and then I went up and handed it to y'all would go, oh, cool, you tagged some whitetails in central North Carolina? Because their home ranges are not seasonally shifting in a way, at least crudely, like as far as just an observation, me looking at them on a page. We're not seeing any really notable seasonal shifts in movement, no obvious migratory behavior. We've only had a handful of individuals that were caught in Oklahoma end up in another state. Like, for example, I don't think, and again, I'm not looking at the points every day, so if I'm wrong, so be it. I'm not aware that a tagged pronghorn has crossed into Colorado yet. I'm not aware that one has crossed into Kansas yet. I'm aware of one for sure that has gone into Texas, and several, between 4 and 10, that have moved back and forth into New Mexico. We had several last spring of 22, move many miles into New Mexico, drop their fawns, donate those fawns to some New Mexican coyotes, and then march all the way back to Oklahoma, back to where they had been tagged. So, so I guess that's a kind of a long answer to your question, but I think we didn't know what to expect when it came to what those collars were going to tell us about how they were using this larger landscape, and we were all surprised to find most of them appear to be homebodies. So
Interesting.
Yeah, well, just looking at them, you would think that they travel a very long distance, as is the norm, just based on the way you see them running around.
Yeah, and based on other areas where people do pronghorn work, like you mentioned in Wyoming and Montana, I mean, I say we, science in general, but other people have documented, fairly notable, fairly long distance migrations, but they're likely driven by environmental factors that maybe don't affect us in the low latitudes, where we don't have really severe winters, and major elevational changes that could allow them to get it better forage. But either way, I still think it's neat because many people predicted that they were going to move a lot more. And knock on wood, in the first 2 years of data collection, we're just not seeing a lot of evidence of that kind of movement.
Interesting.
So, do y'all have bucks and does?
Yes, sir. Yeah, we went heavy on the female side because of that population dynamics component that we alluded to earlier. So when we started, for example, we had 100 collars the first year, and we put 20 on bucks and 80 on does. And that was because in order to get at the reproductive information, we wanted to be biased toward the females, and we used the females in order to capture the fawns. So having more females collared gives us more chances to detect that a female has given birth, and then be able to go in and capture one or both. They usually have twins. I think most of y'all probably know that. Most of your listeners probably know that. But twinning is quite common, with pronghorn. So whether we collar one of them or two of them, the more females we have collared, the more chances we have to put collars on the neonates.
Well, so I want to ask, when you put a collar on a buck, is the hunting community out there? Do they say, "Oh, okay, there's some research going on. I'm not going to shoot that one," or is it like do people get excited about a chance to shoot a collar?
Like a banded mallard, yeah.
Yeah, well, and that's a great analogy, and this is a good topic, and I'll say the answer is both. We've had one hunting season since we started. So, again, we collared our first adults February of 22, which means the fall hunting season last, fall and winter of 22 as we bled into 23 was the first opportunity to test this. And there's some sciencey stuff that might bore people, but at the end of the day, ODWC did not make them off limits. In other words, it is not illegal as of right now for an Oklahoma hunter to look up and say, there's a buck with a collar, I have a buck tag, I want to shoot it, bang. What we like, of course, there's information on that collar on how to turn it back in, because it's pretty expensive equipment. We like to get it back, but we also like to know, well, would the hunter have made a different choice had they seen whether they saw the collar or not? Yeah. And actually, we've had a couple different hunters actually shoot legally. I'm not talking about poaching now. Legal hunters, whether a doe or a buck, in 2 cases I'm familiar with last fall, they didn't actually see the collar. Like one guy, he's actually a cooperating landowner, and again, I'm not going to say any names, but he panicked and he called a grad student that's working on black bears out there and thought, oh no, I've done something wrong here. I've killed this doe. He had a doe tag. It was like the last day of the season. It was the last doe in the group, and he was about to lose them, and he didn't see the collar. And he killed her, walks up to her and goes, uh-oh. Well, that's actually perfectly legal, but it's good for us to know because, Bobby, your question is quite relevant. If all of our hunters went out there and targeted them, then certainly we can't say anything about true risk of hunting mortality because that's super biased, right? Mm-hmm. But it also means that we've spent thousands and thousands of dollars on these collars, and now we've got to hold them in our hand again until the next time the helicopter flies, so we can put them back out. So in an ideal world, hunters would do exactly what they would have done that day had they not seen the collar. So if it's your one day to hunt and you're going to shoot the first buck that walks out, great. But if you hunt for 5 days and you circle all the way back to the place you saw that collared buck the first day and you've passed over 10 others, we like people to at least tell us that because that means they likely sought out the collar. Does that kind of answer your question, Bob?
Yeah, it does. And I think at the end of the day, you would probably prefer that they not shoot an animal that's got a collar.
When in doubt, yes, and that's because that is by far and away a tangential objective to what this project is about. Hunting mortality is a component of things that can kill pronghorn in Oklahoma, but we didn't set out to evaluate the true risk, from a hunting standpoint. Mm-hmm. So you're absolutely right. If folks are listening and they have the choice and they don't care which doe they shoot or which buck they shoot, we would certainly rather they just shoot one that doesn't have a collar on it. And that makes everybody's life easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, get some data they need too.
Yeah.
Glad you asked, Bobby.
Yeah, that's right.
Dudley, you got a question?
Well, so can you tell us a little bit about these private landowners and how they contribute to the project?
Absolutely. Simple answer is without the participation of private landowners and ranchers in Oklahoma, there would be no pronghorn project. Oklahoma, like Texas, is a very private land dominated state. There's not enough public land out there. There are some public lands out there. There's national grasslands in the kind of southwestern part of our panhandle that kind of bleeds into Texas. That's the Rita Blanca National Grasslands. There's Black Mesa State Park. There's a bunch of state school trust land. And many of y'all, and probably your listeners, particularly those that hunt out west, boy, I had to learn that one real quick when I moved from Montana, because in Montana, that state land, you look at something like Onyx Maps, that's publicly accessible. But in Oklahoma, all of that is leased out mostly for grazing. So if you don't have a subsequent lease for hunting or permission from the person who's got the grazing rights, it's not public. So if folks are looking at their maps right now going, well, I see this, and this, it's almost all private. And so huge thank you to the landowners out there that provide access, because we need a place to be able to put the net over the top of those adults, sit the helicopter down for long enough to jump out, it's less than 5 minutes to process an adult that's caught out of the helicopter. But as y'all know, we're very respectful of private property rights. And if somebody says you can't touch the skids down, then we can't touch the skids down. We could theoretically fly over their ranch to get to another ranch, but we need their permission in order to touch the helicopter down, let a crew member out to collar that adult. And then you fast forward to the spring, Same thing applies when we drive up in a pickup truck on a county road and we look out in the pasture and there's a collared doe nursing her fawn. Well, except for the road ditch right there, we can't go into that pasture unless those private landowners are given permission. So it's a huge lift for our team, both for the agency and for the students, to make sure that we try to keep all those relationships. But it's vital to the success of the project. And without those private landowners, we wouldn't get this information.
You know, when he mentions the spring, can you go through how you figure out that this doe pronghorn is having a baby? Because I think the window's pretty tight on you guys to be able to do something.
It is. So when we put the collars out, in academic speak, we have something called fix rate, right? So the collar is around the doe's neck, and we have programmed it to take a GPS location every some number of hours, whether it's 2, 3, 5. We have some control over that. And we make those decisions based on other objectives and battery longevity, because the more points you take and the more transmissions to the satellite you have, the quicker that collar dies. So what we do as we get towards spring, we can remotely command those collars to take more locations and to send us that data more frequently. So what happens is in March, everybody does whatever. In April, everybody does whatever. But as we start moving into May, the students start sending commands to all the does, maybe not the bucks, but to all the does, saying, please, you're basically telling the collar via satellite, please take a location every hour. Please send me those locations every 8 hours. So our crews are out there as we get into mid-May. They're getting a dump of points, theoretically, from all 80 females about every 8 hours. And between the points and some algorithms that we can run that look at clustering behavior. So if you imagine, y'all have all seen dots on a map, in these research projects. Well, you got this pronghorn that moves all over, and then all of a sudden it's dropping a lot of points in one spot. It's forming a little cluster. We actually run it through some programs that do a cluster analysis and will kind of flag the most likely females that we need to look at the next day. And the rest of it is all observational. Then we have crews that go out, they put eyes on that female, and I don't want to be rude here. I'm not making judgment, but when they're real pregnant, they're big. And when they go from big one day to not big the next day,
and there's your sign.
They've had their fawn. That's it. That's what you need to know. And they get pretty good at it to the point that you're driving down the road and it's like, oh, well, there's 3 collared does all together. Well, usually they kind of separate from their friends to have the baby. So when I see them all together, I'm already thinking not pregnant. And then I look at them, they all turn sideways, and I'm like, that one looks like it swallowed a whiskey barrel. She's as big as a battleship. That one's got big sides. They're all still pregnant. But then if I come back to that group the next day and 2 of them are still over here and look big, but the other one is now a mile over there, has been off by herself all night, and we drive up on her and she's back to looking pronghorn skinny, okay, now we're going to watch her. And after that, it's a very observational process where the crews literally keep her in sight, because here in a little while, she's going to go nurse the baby. And when we see that happen, we've got spotters, sometimes in 1 truck, sometimes in 2 trucks, and we let them nurse. We don't try to disturb the situation, but once they rebed, once that neonate rebeds, we've got the spot marked. And if it's real far away, we're using rangefinders. Like I'll be calling out ranges from the passenger seat while somebody else has them in a spotting scope, because, man, you walk out in some of those pastures later and you think, oh, I'm walking right to it, and you're way off. But when you get out to the right range, turn around, shoot the truck, and go, okay, the truck's 440 meters. And then the spotter back there says, yeah, you need to shift. It's like calling we do it like you're doing a dog trial, right? So they're at the truck going over, or over, back.
I know all about that.
Yeah. Well, it's actually kind of fun because I don't do a bunch of that myself, but I've seen enough of it on TV, had buddies that did it. So that's what we train our crews to do. We don't always have cell service. Sometimes we have radios, sometimes we don't. But at the end of the day, that's what leads us to the ability to go and know that, okay, that was the collared mother. That is her baby. Now we can put a collar on that baby. And actually the collar we put on it is linked the technology actually links to the mother's collar. And
Oh, that's
so
cool.
thereafter, the baby's collar, I'm trying to keep this as clear and simple as possible, but the baby's collar is only a radio signal. It's only a very high frequency VHF beacon. So the only way we know if it's alive or dead is by how it beeps, meaning somebody's got to be in the field with an antenna listening for it, and it's either beeping at the normal pulse rate or it's double time, which means it's in mortality, right? Motion sensitive switch, and so now it's in mortality. But this new technology is actually communicating with mom's collar. So if we ever get a situation, I can't remember if it's 8 or 10 hours, where she hasn't been back to that fawn, the mother's collar will send us a message through the satellite directly to the computer at the field house and say, hey, we've got an absence. In other words, we don't know if the baby's dead, but it's absent, meaning mom and baby have not been in close enough proximity to talk to each other. Something's wrong. And I'll just tell you, after 2 springs of this, if our grad students were here, they would say 99 times out of 100, that absent message, that is a mortality message. Because by the time they get out in the field to go follow up on it, they indeed find, the remains of the neonate or the collar and some blood or whatever, where, it's been killed by a predator or whatever. Some of them, died, was weak, non-thrifty, and just died. Anyway, so I think that's kind of
That's cool.
deep dive and
Yeah.
everything.
So somebody directs you to the spot, and so that there's 2 fawn antelopes laying there somewhere, and you got to find them, and then how do you catch them?
Well, so that's a good point. Usually they're separate too. So like in that scenario, we'd get one, we might come back on that female a second day and watch her again. And if a fawn stands up that doesn't have a collar on, that's the twin. But if the fawn stands up that has the collar on, we don't go catch it again. We just have to keep watching, right? But as far as catching them, we walk in as a group. We've got eyes on the spot or close enough that we know when we're getting close. And we've usually got two net people, right? And we're talking about big old salmon nets like you'd see on big boats in Alaska, right? And so they're wide hooped on purpose, not because the fawns are huge, but because you don't want to hit them in the head with a metal net, So we're very careful. All this sounds like it's wild rodeo out there, but ideally it's not, because animal welfare is huge. We can't kill our study animals or our project's not worth anything. But basically we sneak around, usually from behind, and you can see it laying there. And pronghorn are more mobile than anything else I've worked with. So I've never had to worry about using nets on catching whitetail fawns or elk calves. But it does not take very long for a pronghorn fawn to want to jump up and run. And we catch almost everything at less than 5 days old, because after that, if you don't get the jump on it, they'll probably beat you. I mean, they're pretty impressive. They're pretty impressive. But 1 or 2 days old, they often just lay there, and when the net goes over them, some of them don't even move. Some of them struggle a little bit, but at that point they can't get away.
So what's Mama doing?
It varies from just running off to running circles around us. What we might call kind of a defensive behavior, right? Kind of had we been a coyote, it's suggesting that maybe she would have run at us and tried to run the coyote off. Obviously, we're a lot bigger than coyotes, so they usually just kind of stay, 100, 200 yards out, kind of in a nervous pattern, and we try to work that thing up as fast as we can, obviously, because we want to get out of there. So the quicker she gets back to that fawn, the quicker they're back to normal.
Yeah.
But sometimes they'll run, if there's a little terrain, they might disappear from view. But even if we can't see them, our procedure is always the same: get it done as fast as possible and get out of there.
Wow.
Cool.
That's some, as these college students, Colter, they're studying all this stuff, the landowners working together, Department of Conservation.
It's a great effort.
It really is.
And it's such an interesting species, and
Very unique.
I'm kind of an amateur about all this stuff. I don't have a PhD or anything, but it seems like we've been focusing a lot of stuff on deer, and this is exciting that folks are studying something different, a different hooved animal.
Yeah.
And the techniques, what's interesting from my perspective, is a lot of the techniques are really similar. Just the system. The land cover changes. I did my PhD in North Carolina. We darted all our deer. I climbed a tree stand like a hunter. The difference was I was hunting at night with a night vision scope, and it's catch and release. So we had to put a bait pile out, and we had to play the wind, and then you shoot through the night vision. You hit her with a dart, and then you got to track her down. Well, that's because those densely forested systems, you couldn't catch those whitetails with a helicopter. But South Texas, they use helicopters all the time. So it's fascinating to me as I've moved across the country, like I said, from a professional standpoint, that I darted elk in Missouri. All my colleagues in Montana, they helicopter capture elk. And the same crew that caught our pronghorn, the helicopter crew that we contracted, the first year, they had just come from Montana. So their world changed overnight. They went from a bunch of snowy eastern Montana country where they were catching elk and pronghorn there, and then a couple days later they're in no snow, in ag country in western Oklahoma catching pronghorn for us. But from their perspective, they just got to get over that pronghorn and shoot that net down. So it's crazy.
Those guys, I bet they'd be interesting to talk to.
Oh yeah, be fun.
They got to be fearless.
Be fun to ride with. How about it, Richie?
Not me.
Yeah, we talked to some of those guys, and yeah, they pretty fearless. One of the guys, he's working on all 50 states, getting a turkey in all 50 states at Slam.
With a helicopter and a net?
All
No,
50 states.
no, not with a helicopter.
Yeah. Oh, hit the turkey nerds on you. There's not.
But speaking of helicopters,
49.
Colter, being we were there, and we were scheduled to be there for for a few days, and the first day, it's whiteout, and it had dropped,
as in snow.
Yes, as in snow,
Yeah,
and
Mike
like
took short
we don't know what
sleeve
that
shirts.
is.
yeah, and like
Oh yeah, that's right. Owen went out there in his beach wear.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wait, that's right. Yeah.
And so we were down, the helicopters were down, and
Yeah.
first day, and then high winds the second day, and so I think, can you help visualize to these guys just to walk them through the process with the helicopters and what it takes? They're out there netting the pronghorns, and then bringing the data back to you guys to so just walk them through it.
Yeah. So that's funny that I said no snow, because that was the first year. But Richie's right. Here they come to do all this filming, and right out of the gate, we're like, well, hurry up and wait. It's snowing in Oklahoma, and it was just enough snow that visibility was blowing sideways. And so it's not that they couldn't fly, but it doesn't make sense to fly because they're burning fuel. We're having to pay, our grant is paying either by the head or by the hour. So sometimes you just have to make the decision collectively. Also, we just to be clear, we want those helicopter crews to be safe, because we joke about it. We say fearless. Yeah, you're right. I'd say crazy. Some of them, but they're really, really good at what they do, and that goes from the pilot to the gunner to what's called the mugger. So when the conditions were right, we got the helicopter up, and basically they go to either grid searching basically from the air, or because we've got collars out now, we can send them to recent locations of herds so they can target additional members of that herd. In other words, we don't necessarily need them to recapture unless we knew a collar was failing. So, but they can use that. It's like the Judas pig. Y'all have heard about that. We kind of got the Judas pronghorn. So as long as we know where some of the collared animals are, we can send the helicopter and speed up their search process. And then essentially, you talk about them being fast. They have to fly with them, and the pilot has to keep everything in line. He's got to stay flanked just right. He's got to see the county road coming up. He's got to watching for power lines. He's got to turn them into the property that we can actually capture on. So back to our private land issue. Let's say they're running along and they cross a boundary. Well, they're looking at maps in their helicopter that are provided by our ground crew. Every day we're uploading essentially a map that shows shapefiles of permission. And those pilots are pretty good, because it is perfectly legal for him to continue chasing that group on a property that we don't have permission to be on the ground in. But what he's doing is looking at that map going, oh, 200 more yards. When they cross that ditch line right there, we're good.
Yeah.
And so when they cross the ditch line, he puts it to them, turns them the way he wants. They try to use terrain as much as they can. If there's any uphill, to run them uphill, they try to get them going uphill because it slows them down a little bit. And again, that's a welfare issue, because imagine if you were running as fast as you could and somebody hovering above you in a helicopter shot a net over you. It's designed to make you trip and fall. So we're trying to minimize the amount of injury that could happen from that capture event. And that's why I said these crews are amazing, because the guy shooting the gun, the one y'all were joking about, Andy Orlando's the guy who you're talking about getting turkeys in 49 states. This year, when he got to our project, he had just celebrated his 10,000th animal captured.
Wow.
10,000 individuals that he has handled or netted from a helicopter.
That's wild.
So we contract that because there is no amount of learning curve that I or my students could go through to make a project like this happen. Rather, you budget and you use these professional companies, and they know how to fit a collar. They know how to draw blood. They know how to take a tissue sample. All the things that we do, Richie alluded to that, they bring us those samples back in a gallon Ziploc bag. We give them, we call it a capture kit. We give them a gallon Ziploc that's strapped to a collar. Well, they go out with, they might have 15 of those in the helicopter, maybe 20. They go do their thing until it's time to refuel, and they come back to the landing zone that we've established where their fuel truck is waiting. And when they get out, they come, and we always love it when they hand us an armful of gallon Ziplocs, because every one of those Ziplocs is now missing a collar. But that Ziploc has blood sample, tissue sample, anything else that we've asked them to take on that individual. And then the grad students and the technicians, they go to work in the pickup truck. We've got a small, they call them field centrifuge, right? So just like a centrifuge they'd use to run your blood at the doctor's office, the difference is these are a little smaller. They're designed to run in the truck, in the field. And while the helicopter refuels, they get a snack break. They take off and go hunt again. Meanwhile, our crew starts processing all those samples. And, here in a minute, I may get a text from the pilot. We always say don't text and drive. Apparently, you can text and fly. I hope he just hovers for a minute, and
Our local crop duster does the same.
You might have just gotten him in trouble.
No, well, yeah, but often we're communicating because he might say, well, let's move to the next landing zone. Because, again, he's looking at his fuel consumption. He's looking at where we're hunting. We call it hunting that day. And then when we're done spinning blood, we rally up our whole convoy and we move to the next LZ. And here in another 2 hours, you hear the helicopter coming, rinse and repeat. And so we do that every day for as many days as it takes. So far for us, we budget probably 4 days. But with situations like what Richie experienced, where day one became day zero because we basically didn't get to fly. And so that changes our timeline a little bit. But in the end, we got, this past year was rougher weather-wise, but we got what we needed out of the capture event. And then they took a break, and some of them loaded up in the truck. The pilot closed the doors, and he flew back to Colorado. And the next day they were going to be, I believe this year, they were going to be catching wolves somewhere. That was their next job. So those crews y'all were talking about, they're fearless, absolutely, and they go job to job to job until the season is done.
What was the guy's name that had 10,000?
Andy Orlando.
Let's hit the horns for Andy one time. That is.
I'll say his name on there. He'll like it. I'll have to tell him that we're talking about him. But yeah, they're like I said, we've been really, really pleased with them. There's several companies, but a lot of these different states. It's almost like I don't want to say competing, not in a bad way, but when we're ready to schedule, we're trying to get them on the calendar because they're going to be working somewhere. We try to lock in our stuff as soon as we know when we want to do those captures so that we can get them on the calendar because they could get a whiteout in Montana, decide to leave that job early, jump down to us, but then they got to get us done as quick as they can so they can get back to the Montana job. Because they're juggling all kinds of winter weather conditions in places a lot rougher than the Oklahoma Panhandle.
Yeah, no. Boy, that sounds like quite a job.
Yeah,
So,
sounds
Laney,
like fun.
you got a question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit off of the what we're talking about with the research going on, but they're called pronghorns, but don't they shed their antlers every year? So does it have an antler? I mean, or is it a horn?
I don't think they should.
All right.
I think they do.
I think
they
he's
shed
going to
the sheep.
answer.
What? Oh yeah. Why don't you
Well,
let him?
let's-
I didn't know you were a biologist.
Let the expert
I
answer.
thought you were anyways.
Hey, he did good though.
Yeah.
He did good. I heard sheath. All right, so I love this, and I'll tell you what I call them, and we go over this in like classes, for undergrads. That is what is fascinating about their. So we'll start with headgear, right? Everybody knows they got something on their head. What do we call it? I would say if you never used a word other than antler or horn, I'd pick horn for pronghorn. Okay. But I actually think it's completely appropriate, and this is a unique species, as we've already talked about. I call them pronghorns. The actual structure, pronghorns. And the reason is they actually have characteristics of both. So everything y'all were just kind of arguing about, most horns, for example, don't branch. But pronghorn, as you know, have the prongs. So that branching is more antler-like than it is horn-like. Okay? But that sheath, the black part that we're all looking at, in the fall when we're after, the big buck, that is a keratinized sheath. That is keratin, which is the hair-like fibers that are in horns, not the bone that is back there on that deer behind y'all on the wall, which is a characteristic of antlers. And then to make it even worse, they do shed the sheath annually. Well, horns are never shed, but that whitetail back there shed every year of his life, right? So basically, we just went through all the lists where you're trying to define one or the other, and pronghorn, again, as if to prove how unique they are, their headgear has characteristics that make them kind of somewhere in the middle. So I actually often encourage students, I said, well, hey, they're unique already. Let's call their headgear pronghorns.
Pronghorns, that makes sense.
But I definitely have a hard time trying to call them antlers, because antlers are so specifically, they look, y'all know what it is. You look at a mule deer, a whitetail, an elk, it's bone. It looks like bone. They all look that way. It's real hard to make that argument for pronghorn.
So when it sheds that keratin layer, what's left under there, is that bone?
Oh, yes, thank you. I meant that was the last part. That is a bone. There's a bony core underneath, which again, kind of weird, because that means there's bone on its head. But the bone itself is not being shed, which is what happened to that whitetail behind you right there. So just a very unique animal.
And does that bone get larger every year with age or nutrition?
That's a good question.
It's like a baculum growing out of the head.
He can't get that out of his
Honestly,
mind.
I'm not sure. I imagine there's inter-individual variation for sure. I don't know that there's a lot of growth like once it's established. But there could be variation in how large it was when it was established. But that's why a lot of times when it comes to pronghorn, that sheath, y'all have heard this, hunters talk about it all the time, like, oh, I don't want to hunt in a drought year, or I want to hunt when I know range conditions were good, because that growth of the part we're looking for, right? The black sheath that we see in the fall can be really variable. It's not quite as correlated to age the way we think about whitetails and mule deer and elk, where we know that if we can get them into older age categories, yes, there's still variation in their headgear based on nutritional plane and genetics, but we know they tend to get bigger with age up until a point. And the thing about pronghorn is you could shoot a giant 3-year-old just as easily as you could shoot a giant 6-year-old.
Interesting.
It's just very unique and very different from what we think about with the antlered species, deer and elk.
But I was listening to the rain comment, though. It's got to be tied to nutrition in some way.
Yeah, and that's the thought, and that's why you hear hunters talking about, like, if you're trying to wait 10, 12 years to pull a special tag somewhere, they're trying to figure out and time that with a year where they feel like the headgear growth is going to be
Sure.
as big as possible, rather than hunting a unit that you've been waiting on for a decade and it's been in a 3-year drought.
Yeah.
You know that
Yeah.
some
animal.
states are known for having a lot better headgear than others. I think like New Mexico is known for some bigger antelope, if I'm not mistaken, and I think Wyoming they're not as typically as big.
Thank you, Mr. Know-It-all.
Yeah, I never knew he's such an antelope
Well,
aficionado.
you know, I have killed one.
Oh, you have. I've seen the pictures.
Yeah, I have killed one.
Well, and you're right. Honestly, as a hunter, stepping outside the research for a minute, I would agree, Bobby. I mean, I've heard the same thing. Some of the most highly sought after units being in this state instead of that state. I'm sure there are some components there related to pressure and total harvest and whatnot, as well as range conditions. But by and large, it's in the eye of the beholder.
Sure. Yeah, no
100%.
doubt there. And one thing that I remember about them is they're not very big. When you walk up on one laying there, it's not like a great big old whitetail
Yeah.
laying there.
So what are they? A big buck is what, 80, 90 pounds?
Over 100, maybe up to maybe 130.
Okay, so
Pounds.
that's about as big as a live weight of a pronghorn buck.
And
Yeah,
they're thin
I think
skinned.
I think what he's thinking is like, if you imagine. I mean, I remember being with my buddy Marcus Lashley in Alabama one time, and we killed a doe that weighed like I don't remember if it was 128 or 132 pounds.
That's a good one
She was
right there now,
She was
boy.
huge.
Makes me hungry.
Black belt of Alabama. That's a big old girl. So that's the weird overlap there. What you're not expecting is like you walk up on a big. I keep pointing at y'all's mounted whitetail. You walk up on that man. Oh man, it weighs 250 pounds. Yeah, they're not 250 pound pronghorn. So does. I wish I had a live weight. I hunted in Montana last year, and killed a buck and a doe, and we've never had the ability where we hunt to weigh one. But when I walk up on them, I'm thinking more like an eastern whitetail hunter. I'm definitely not thinking anything near a cow elk. You know what I mean?
Right.
They're quite small. They're kind of compact. They can be, if you think about watching them run, that they can look kind of chunky through the chest in a way, through the chest and the hindquarters, but they're not real tall. I think that's what gets me when I walk up on one, is if they were standing beside you, they just seem really diminutive.
Mm-hmm.
All their body weight is in that muscle mass that allows them to run really fast.
So the pronghorns only really inhabit that small portion in the Panhandle, correct?
In Oklahoma, that's correct.
So compared to other states that have pronghorn covering a larger area, what kind of numbers do hunters take every year around there? Do you know that? I know that's not really in your wheelhouse.
Yeah,
but
that's a great question, and I hate to guess at it exactly. I know I've looked through numbers here and there. From the standpoint of the quick and dirty surveys that ODWC does, I'm talking about not the hunting for a second, but just the aerial overflights that they do. We're probably only talking about 800 to 1,500 pronghorn in and around the Oklahoma Panhandle moving
Right.
back. I'm just talking kind of total population size. And that's the number that they think has declined a bit over the last decade. Part of why they want to know that, as you can imagine where I'm going next, is when you are issuing tags, at some point, you may have to decide whether or not you need to be issuing as many doe tags.
sure.
Because Oklahoma does have opportunity for both buck and doe. It's not come one, come all. There's no way they could support that. So somebody like me, who I'm not a landowner out there, so I've got no angle on landowner tags, I've got no angle on damage tags, that kind of thing. I'm having to put in, as a resident of Oklahoma, for a drawing to try to draw a tag. And even once I did, I better go get friendly with a rancher that'll let me on, because there's not a whole bunch of public out there. Matter of fact, you may not even be able to use the tag on public. I'd have to check. So I don't know, and I hate to hazard a guess at what the harvest has been in recent years. I can get that if y'all want to include it later. But I do know that their anecdotal evidence is that there's a mix of reports from on the ground. They get maybe hunters saying, well, I'm not seeing as many as I used to. Some of the ranchers say that. Then you got some ranchers, particularly some folks, farmers doing ag. Well, they're mad because there's 40 head on their wheat field, so they think we need to shoot more of them. So as always, there's a little bit of a push-pull there, and the agency's trying to strike that balance, but they're also trying to make sure that the herd is sustainable at whatever level, because we could target problem areas with nuisance tags, but we don't want to over-harvest other areas because we don't have our finger on the pulse. And that's again, back to the very beginning of this, that's why this project is of value, because it gives them more data from a population standpoint to work with to figure out whether or not areas can support the same or more or less doe harvest than other areas.
Gotcha. So that sounds like it's pretty limited. You can't just go buy a tag. You gotta put in for draw and very, very limited.
The only way you can do that, I think, is with archery. Again, I've only been here a few years, and certainly I have not prioritized, trying to go out to the Panhandle for pronghorn. But I think the only way you could hunt pronghorn every year in Oklahoma right now, barring a land ownership opportunity, is you'd have to be archery hunting. I think that is the only real come one, come all opportunity. If I ever draw that pronghorn tag I'm talking about, that's it. That's a lifetime draw.
Okay.
You either shoot one or not, but you're done in Oklahoma.
Okay.
Again, unless you're landowners out there that have access to other options related to land ownership and nuisance complaints and whatnot. So.
Good deal.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Mac, you keep looking at me like you got a question.
I do. With them being plains prairie animals, I'm just curious if their eyesight or their nose is better.
I'd go with eyesight for sure. They, again, think about this from a hunting perspective. I'm far more worried if a pronghorn can see me than what direction the wind's blowing. Put it that way. And none of us would do that if we were thinking about hunting whitetails in central Mississippi, right? You'd be playing the wind first and foremost, banking on the fact that as long as it got close enough to your archery setup, the eyes aren't going to matter at that point. At that point, you're far more worried that if you draw your bow and make a sound, they're going to hear you up in the tree, right? So I would flip that for pronghorn. Their eyesight has been compared to 8-power binoculars. So if you think about where they evolved, right, where they've been historically, the types of predators that they have to avoid, eyesight is number one. Scent and hearing matter, but at a much closer range. And I can only think of a handful of times where I know I've been winded by a pronghorn and actually heard them blow or snort the way we think about whitetails. But I bet all y'all been snorted at quite a few times by whitetails. That's happening all the time.
Oh yeah.
But with pronghorn, it just seems like they see and they start running.
I've got one more question. I wanted to fact check Bobby on this. He said they smell like corn chips. What do you think that they have that smell?
I never knew you was such a antelope aficionado.
I don't think I said that.
Love it.
Bobby just stuck his nose down there and smelled it.
I'm gonna swoop in here and save Bobby again. I don't know if you'd asked me that question years and years ago. I don't know if I would have said corn chips because I'd have been trying to think what to compare it to. But now that I've heard lots of people say that, they do have a really unique smell.
I smell like Fritos.
And I can see how the Frito corn chip comparison was made. So again, you might decide that you'd compare it to something a little bit different, but they do have a really interesting smell.
And their meat is the one that I was able to kill many years ago. We cooked him, and it was delicious meat.
It's fantastic. I hope your listener, I know we'll get crucified because somebody will say, no, they taste horrible. That's the thing with pronghorn. You meet both ends of that pendulum. It's either they think they're the worst thing in the world, or I'll say it right now at risk of getting stoned later. I would probably, if I was doing my own steak at the house, like maybe say doing something in a cast iron real quick, small steak cut, I will pick a pronghorn over an elk.
Ooh.
Wow,
Whoa,
that's bold.
Wow, that's pretty serious.
Bold move there.
I thought he was going to say whitetail.
Oh yeah, that's easy. Yeah, no, but I did have to be provocative on purpose because elk meat has that reputation, right, of just being it's the closest thing to kind of like beef steak that we have. But I think, in my experience, I think the reason I pick it is I'm often dealing with smaller cuts of meat on pronghorn, and it's even more tender. So it's every bit as flavorful in my view, but even more tender than a 4 or 5 year old rutted up bull. So I love it. My wife loves it. I encourage anybody who doesn't believe it, like, just be sure to handle the meat properly. What I hate seeing in eastern Montana, I lived in Missoula for 4 years. That's on the west end of the state, but we did most of our pronghorn hunting in southeast Montana. Lots of public land out there, fairly easy to draw even for non-residents. And we'd be coming down the highway, and here comes a pickup truck on the interstate with just legs sticking up, look like a bunch of octopus back there. There'd 4 or 5 pronghorn piled up, all the legs sticking up. Well, October in Montana, eastern Montana, when it's sunny, even if you don't feel hot like we all do right now in the southeast, it's still 75, 80 degrees.
Yeah.
And keeping that hide on, I think, is the driver of people who do not like the gamey taste of pronghorn. I have had only one in my friend group that ever approached that gamey taste that people hate. And I realize I'm a scientist, and so it's a small sample size, but that is the only one I'm ever aware of that, because of where we were, we were hunting on a ranch by permission, and because of where we were and where he wanted us to go process it, that one had the hide on for at least 60 minutes, maybe 90, before we took care of it. So nowhere near a half a day drive across the state. And that is the only one that ever tasted funny to me. Every other one, we shot it, we went up, we took our appropriate photos, not like we just raced up, we had time. But then we get the hide off, we use the gutless method, get them in game bags, get the meat cool, and it is fantastic. So that's sorry to get on a rant there, guys, but I really think a lot about pronghorn meat.
Yeah, it's good to know.
I like
good
that,
information.
That gutless method too. I like that.
Oh yeah,
works good. So let me ask you this: the times that I've been out west, it seems like pronghorn lend themselves to being so visible from the roads. Is there a poaching problem out there that occurs with these animals that may not occur with some of the others? Maybe mule deer, I suppose, but boy, they just seem so visible.
That's a good question, and I would say so. Across the range, I'm sure there's some variable answers. There's probably people in Wyoming and Montana that would have strong opinions by their experience there. I will say, so far in the Oklahoma project, we've been surprised. We were told by many folks that a lot of the actual violations associated with that type of egregious behavior, out of season, shooting something from a road, we were told was far more common eastward in Oklahoma than in the Panhandle, and partly due to maybe the visibility, the fact that it's a lot harder to get away with it when your truck can be seen 1.5 miles across a wheat field, as opposed to eastern Oklahoma. So without casting stones on where people come from, we've had, I think, 2 that I can think of that we know were poached. One was a buck, and unfortunately one was a doe. And the collared doe that was killed, if I'm remembering the story right, was shot alongside 2 other does and left to lay. So the game warden's sense of that was it was somebody who just didn't like pronghorn. Bobby, to your point, they're available, they're visible. Pull over on the side of a county road with nobody around, bang, 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 there's 3 does. So it makes them easy to hunt in a way because we can encounter pronghorn at a greater frequency than we can something like an elk. But unfortunately, that means the opportunity to shoot them from the road or poach them might go up as well.
Yeah, that's tough to think about. Goodness gracious. Do you have any stories of guys shooting something with a collar and not realize, maybe sticking the collar in their truck and not reporting it? And I've always heard that this happened, and you guys were able to track it down and give them a chance to at least.
Well, So one, it's a story, and it almost is going to be funny because I suspected where it was going, and then we got the collar back before it happened. But the guy actually called. He called here at my office, gave me the whole report. I had everything, and he was on his way to bear hunt in Colorado. So he had legally hunted Oklahoma with his tag here, filled the tag, and actually lived in central Oklahoma. And so he didn't need to come all the way back to central Oklahoma. He needed to go use his fall bear tag in Colorado. And so he said, well, would it hurt y'all too much if I waited and gave you the collar when I got back? And I said, well, no, that won't be a problem. He goes, well, is there anything I need to do to it to turn it off? I said, well, no, there's, I was keeping it simple just to tell y'all. I mean, the only way we can shut it down would be with like placing a magnet in the right spot. Right. And so I told him, no, unfortunately not, but it's no big deal. You're talking about burning up another week of data points. I said, but I am going to know everywhere you park to go bear hunting. and he was like, now, hang on. I said, look, I'm not going to come steal your Colorado bear hunting spot. I got no interest in it myself. But the implication was, yes, we could have tracked him all the way on his trip, every 2 or 3 hours, dropping a pin everywhere he drove, everywhere he parked, for the whole thing. And as it would happen, he hung up with me, and 5 minutes later, he pulled over in a gas station out there in Oklahoma, or western Oklahoma, where he was at. And the state big game biologist and one of the game wardens were standing at the gas station, and he went over and introduced himself and handed off our collar. And then he went on to Colorado. And then the big game biologist called me and said, hey, I just had a hunter report one. I got the collar for you. And I was like, well, that's weird. I just had a hunter report one. And after 5 minutes of figuring out, oh, it's the same guy. And so I joked that he didn't want me to know where he was hunting in Colorado, so he went ahead and turned that collar in.
Yeah, I would. I need to get one of those. I'd like to put one of those on Lanny's truck at some point during turkey season.
No.
Yeah,
Well, they have these things called AirPods.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. So
Let me know if we ever have a spare, Bobby. I could ship you one, and you could just put it in his stuff when you're not looking.
yeah, that's that.
He
that
can't
would be
keep up
good.
with me.
So, have we asked all the right questions here? Is there anything left Richie, from you? Is there anything else we need to ask?
Well, one thing I was going to bring up, earlier, Colton, you talked about home range, but what about habitat? What is from the research, the data you guys have gotten, and what does it show about their habitat and what they need?
Yeah, what is ideal?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So, and I'm glad you asked it, because the short answer is we haven't analyzed any of that yet. So I don't have real hardcore answers for what seems to be ideal in Oklahoma. But the reason we're collecting it is we have an interesting gradient within our study area. For those that are familiar, we've been saying Panhandle, but we're working in the western half of the Panhandle. So if anybody pulls up a map and you see where Guymon, Oklahoma is, that's right in the center of Texas County. From Guymon to New Mexico, that's where we're focused. And once you start getting east of Guymon toward Beaver County, there's still a few pronghorn, but they're really starting to fall out, like we talked about earlier. So what's interesting about that is the Texas County, western Texas County, is far more agriculture based than the stuff we see closer and closer to New Mexico. So one of the things that we're interested in, we got collars from right there in Guymon all the way west, which means we have this kind of gradient of available habitats to pronghorn. Everything from, really heavy ag dominated, just straight up tabletop flatland, all the way toward this kind of getting into mesa country, much more native rangeland, cattle grazing, but not so much center pivots and ag. So we're very interested in looking at whether or not those two situations predispose females, for example, to have higher or lower fawn survival, or to have nutritional metrics in their feces. So I'm going to switch. I'm answering Richie's question, I promise, but we also collect fecal material on these animals, not only the adults when we catch them at the helicopter, but we're doing observations in the field collecting feces, because we can actually use the fecal material to assess nutritional quality. It's a proxy, it's an index, but we can assess the nutritional quality of the diet via nitrogen and phosphorus measured from the fecal material. We can also send that fecal material to a lab and use something called DNA metabarcoding to identify the plant species that are present in the fecal material. So if your gears are turning, you're thinking, okay, you're literally starting to build a picture of not only the GPS locations that show where this individual lived, but now potentially being able to connect that to the actual diet as proxied through the fecal material and what kind of nutritional plane they were on. So that's the long answer to say we don't know yet, but that is a big component of how we're blending the movement data with the underlying landscape to get at how that might affect the fitness of the population. Higher productivity, lower productivity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's high tech too.
You're finding out what they eat.
That's right. Yeah, I should have just said we're finding out what they eat. That'd have been easier.
Oh gosh, guys, this has been really interesting.
Yeah, very interesting.
The times that I've been out west, when I see an antelope, there's just something about them. They're just so remarkable.
They're just different.
Yeah,
Yeah, they are.
beautiful animals.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I was the same way.
Colter, have you gotten to hunt them much?
Yeah, well, when I moved to Montana and lived in Missoula, I worked at the University of Montana before I came here to OSU, and though I didn't do any research, my buddies like to joke I had to move away from Montana to actually get to work on pronghorn. I did, as a resident there, start to pull my first tags. So I think I've killed like 5 bucks and 4 does, something like that, over my the 3 or 4 resident seasons that I had, and I have now traveled back to Montana one time as a non-resident with my brother from Georgia. It was his first ever pronghorn hunt last fall, and we both pulled a buck tag and a doe tag and hunted with my buddies that still live in Montana last fall. So, and we actually did really well. If you were looking for stories, when you've made a little bit of relationships, you got some private land access, we often hunt all on public, and I love that. I got no problem with it. But we happened to befriend a rancher 2 years ago, and they're just fantastic, and they love us coming. We actually, one of my buddies pulls his camper all the way from Missoula. We hooked the camper up in their yard, turned it into a big deal. We had 19 tags in camp because most people had 2 tags, and we killed 19 pronghorn in 2.5 days.
That's a lot of work and a lot of fun.
That's a good bit of meat.
Yeah, man.
We joked that it was a local extinction event, but it really wasn't, because we some of those were on public, most of them were on private. The only way we were able to do that, I don't want to sound braggy because it's not just about killing stuff, but those of us that were traveling out of state, we're trying to maximize our opportunity.
Sure.
Because we can't stay in Montana for 10 days. My brother's got to get back to work. He's got kids and a wife in Georgia. But having that infrastructure, having those connections, and having enough people, we broke off into different teams. We'd come back together and see each other for the first time at lunch. And, Dan's group had killed 2 does and a buck that morning. They're already on ice. Meanwhile, we're rolling up, and my brother's just killed his first one. Another buddy with me was a first timer. So over the span of 2.5 days, we just had a great time. And Bobby, to your point, when I was 8 years old, my dream was to be able to hunt pronghorn. I don't know why I was so drawn to them as a kid. And then as I got into this field, even prior to me ever hunting them, I was already daydreaming back in my North Carolina days working on whitetails. Man, wouldn't it be cool to do pronghorn research? And I had no idea that it would more or less fall in my lap in the first 3 months that I lived in Oklahoma.
Wow.
Well, that's
So
great.
here we are.
Cool story,
Yeah,
bro.
No doubt about it.
Yeah, that is good. Well, Colter, we have really enjoyed talking to you.
Absolutely.
Dr. Colter Chitwood from Oklahoma State University. He's got a lot of research going on. I know that we're going to ask you to do some other things with us. I really want to hear about your Alaska wolf research.
Okay.
Happy
to do it.
So.
I like talking to y'all too. It's fun.
Good.
Well, look, at this point, we always kind of turn it over. Dudley likes to. We've got a thing called rapid fire. We'll ask you. He will ask you a bunch of questions real fast, and we get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah.
It's brought to you by our friends at Springfield Armory. They make
a heck of a pistol.
They make some great pistols.
Yeah.
So, look, I don't know what's about to happen, Colter, but I'm gonna turn it over to Dudley.
All right, Colter. I don't know if you've ever heard us do this before or not, but it's fun. So
It's like a psychology exam.
it
That's
is.
the word
It
association
is.
game.
This
Oh, man,
is a
I'm
test.
nervous now.
This is a test. So just be prepared to answer the questions as quickly as you can. If you want to, you can say both or neither. But
Okay.
anyway, we're going to try to get to know you a little better here. Are you ready?
All right, let's go.
All right. Homegrown tomatoes, just salt and pepper or salt and pepper and mayo?
Salt and pepper.
Fresh peaches or fresh watermelon?
Peaches every day and twice on Sunday.
Lemonade or limeade?
Lemonade.
Would you rather eat homegrown tomatoes or refrigerator pickles?
I'm going to go pickles.
Watermelon or watermelon with salt?
Oh, I'd dabble in both. I usually watermelon without salt, but I'd say both. They're
All
both
right.
good.
Yeah, good.
Fly fish, Pennsylvania or North Georgia?
Ooh, I'm going to go North Georgia because where I'm from.
All
South
right.
Pennsylvania.
Montana or Wyoming?
Montana.
Fish early in the morning or late in the afternoon?
Late evening.
All right.
Evening.
Fly fish summer or fall?
Summer for me.
Tie your own flies or pick them up at the local tackle shop?
Both.
Turkey hunt,
Ooh.
east of Mississippi or west of Mississippi?
East of Mississippi.
All right. Turkey hunting, do you rake away the leaves before sitting down or do you just plop on down?
I'll plop down so I can use them to rake.
There we go. Ooh,
right.
yeah. Nice.
And last but not least, cane yelper, trumpet, or wang bone?
I'll go trumpet.
All
right.
I'm scared to say wangbone.
Good answer.
Hey, good job. That was good.
Yeah, those are good, Dudley.
Good.
That was fun.
I'm kind of in a summer food mood.
Yeah, I
if
can
you-
tell.
you hadn't
Tomatoes.
figured out.
I noticed
I've been
that.
wearing
I
out
noticed
the
that.
refrigerator pickles myself. So
I was ready if you started into blackberries. I was like, cobbler, yes. You know?
blackberries or dewberries? Yeah.
That's right.
All the above.
Well, Colter, we appreciate having you. I'm
Yeah,
gonna
we
send
do.
you some. We've got we revised an old brand around here called Mossy Oak Companions. Some of us are wearing some shirts. I'm gonna get a couple of them out in UPS to you in the next couple of days. So
Awesome. That sounds great.
Is there anybody you need to say hello to, or anybody you need to give a thanks to for helping with this project? Probably need to make sure we call out.
Oh, well, yeah. Again, just acknowledging that, ODWC is the primary funder, and it's a 5-year project. It's quite an investment on their part, but obviously a valuable one. Private landowners for access, of course, and the relationships that we're building with those bordering states is also important because we never know when we may need to follow up on Oklahoma pronghorn that end up in Kansas or Texas or what have you. And finally, our other partners. We're doing this work. It's run through OSU. We're the point institution on it, but it does involve students and faculty from East Central University and down at Caesar Clayburgh in Texas.
I tell you, he's
a big old
got
team.
a website too. And is it called the Chitwood Lab?
Yeah, I think if you Google Chitwood Lab, it pops up. It's a WordPress website. I think I forget how they do it, but Colter Chitwood WordPress, I'd probably find it too. But yeah, that's where I put my lab updates and try to keep my grad student and projects updated periodically.
Hey, one thing, Colter, I was going to ask you, but this is kind of the flow of things. Just one question here. If you could just talk about the data you're getting from the collars on the fawns. What is that showing you?
Yeah, okay. So the fawn collars are primarily giving us survival information for the fawn age class. So in other words, as long as the fawn's alive and the collar's beeping normally, we know the fawn is alive. When we get that signal that either the mom hasn't been nearby or we're out there tracking that collar and the VHF tells us that the collar has been still for 8 hours or whatever, we know that's abnormal. We go in and investigate the mortality calls. So we're not getting spatial data. We're not getting any GPS points on the collar that goes on the fawn, and that's mainly because you're trying to keep that collar as small and as lightweight as possible in order to fit on the baby. And the way the collar works is it actually expands as the fawn grows.
Oh, yeah.
So it's sewed with pleats in it and with a special special stitch that degrades when exposed to UV and water. So over time, it's basically getting weaker and weaker. So as the young pronghorn's neck is growing, it's putting pressure on that collar to pop those pleats, and it'll actually expand out. Potentially, that battery will run for a year. So if the collar stays around its neck and doesn't just completely rip off, it's possible that a fawn that we're really finished tracking in August, we might actually be able to hear it next May or June until finally that battery goes dead, or like I said, eventually that collar just rips apart. So it ends up looking like this. So this is one that came off of a whitetail deer, but see how faded that is? This is how it started.
Oh yeah, look there.
See those pleats? So it's the same, again, that's for whitetails, so it's a little bit different shape, a little different size, but it's the exact same technology. And so in our case, that's all that fawn stuff is designed to understand fawn survival and causes of fawn mortality.
So when mama gives birth and there's two fawns laying there, does she move them from that birthing spot?
Pretty quickly, yes.
And how far? And so they're so young. How can they? That's amazing that they can make that little small journey.
Yeah, it's really true of all the species that y'all would hunt, mule deer, whitetails. They all move pretty quickly. There's a period of time right after she has them where she licks them clean, so they're all kind of got the amniotic fluid on them. So they lick it clean. They often eat the afterbirth, which is nutrient rich, but it's also thought that that's probably reducing some of the potential odor that could attract a predator while she's licking them clean. But even with something like a whitetail that is maybe a bit less mobile than a pronghorn, pretty quickly they can move them from the birth site, and almost without fail they do separate the twins. So one might go one way some distance and one might go the other. Those distances vary. There's no real set distance that it could be, but that's why I mentioned earlier when you're talking about whether or not the pronghorn can get away, they're pretty mobile pretty quick. So the earlier we find them the better, but a brand new 5-hour-old neonate, even if it tries to run from me, it's not going to get away. It's not that mobile at 5 or 10 hours of age, but at 5 days, they can be pretty impressive. So we try to catch them really young. I mean, data wise, we need them really young. Otherwise, there's bias in the data set. But also, we can't catch them when they're real old because, I mean, I used to be fast, but I ain't fast anymore.
And what's neonate? I've heard you say that, so I'm assuming it's a young.
Yeah,
fawn.
That's my bad. Yeah, that's exactly it. We tend to refer to neonate as these very young age individuals that are still able to be captured versus like, if you're sitting in a deer stand this October and you see a doe and a fawn walk by,
you ain't finna catch
by then, well, right, it's not even got spots, in most cases. And so functionally, the two terms could be interchangeable, but a lot of times when we say neonate, we mean those really young, very catchable fawns.
Gotcha.
So
cool.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah, it's an interesting look.
I got it right here.
Yeah.
Right.
So Colter, look, we've enjoyed having you. Sure
Yeah.
appreciate you being on. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Well, guys, we always we talk about what did we learn.
Yeah.
There's I don't know. I mean, there's a lot to learn about antelope.
Well, you already know everything about antelope, apparently.
Well, so I didn't know that they aren't an antelope. I didn't know that.
I got to shoot one because one, I want to smell it.
Yeah, it smells like Fritos.
And
Fritos
two, I want to eat it.
Yeah.
So
I don't remember them smelling like Fritos, but I remember them smelling very sagey.
So you said corn chips.
No, I didn't. I think Mac just
made that up.
He maybe Googled it in his.
Oh,
spare
okay,
time.
okay.
I hadn't said that.
Nah, super unique animal. I mean, we talk about diversity all the time. The way our natural resources can create something like that is pretty cool. It's akin to a giraffe. That's pretty wild.
Yeah, that kind of.
And they have horns and antlers. They are pronghorns, so it's
They look like, back when the flood ended, they didn't get off on the ark where they were supposed to.
Something like that. Yeah, that's a good way of putting
Yeah,
it.
that is true.
Yeah. Well, look, these guys like Colter are just so fascinating to learn what
Yeah,
they're
the
doing.
research, no doubt about it. And like you hit on this a little bit, the work they're doing across state lines with the agencies, with private landowners, all in the name of the resources. Pretty cool.
Yeah, that's impressive.
It is.
And I think for him to get the private landowners to cooperate, that's
Yeah.
a big deal. But it doesn't surprise me that the states cooperate.
Yeah.
It seems like that doesn't surprise me at all.
That's an important resource.
Yeah, it is. It is.
I do think, Lanny, one of the things that I learned is that if I could get one of these GPS, I could put it on the LS tractor.
You
and
might
then
know
I
where
would
it is.
know where
You
it
might
is
know
at
where
that
it is.
point. That would help me, I think. So,
That's a good. That's a good point.
yeah, I thought about that while he was explaining, and I said, maybe I need an air.
You could,
AirPod.
find out where I am. You could put
What's
one
the
under
deal
my
with the
truck.
AirPod?
Yeah, what is that?
An AirPod?
Well,
I've got a friend that's in Europe right now, and her luggage has not made it, but she put an AirPod in her luggage, and she's tracked it all over the place, and has called and said it's in such and such airport, such as
So is it what?
Track it like a tile.
right.
Yeah.
You put like a tag on it. It's like a luggage tag basically.
I thought he was talking about the headphones.
I don't know what he
Is that what they're called?
I don't think they're called a pod.
Okay, whatever. But it's some kind of Apple thing,
Oh, okay. A towel.
right?
He apparently doesn't know exactly what he's talking about either. But I hear you.
Yeah.
But you're not going to track me in the spring.
What about Life 360? We could like put that on your phone.
You're not putting anything on my phone yet.
Yeah. I don't want to track you.
Only thing on my phone is Onyx. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
hey, and point well taken too. All those public land out there, we need to be sure that everybody knows not to stomp around on that without private landowner permission.
Yeah. I'm sure Onyx has got that figured out so that people don't.
Send David McElwain a note. Yeah.
Speaking of somebody, I'd want to put one of those things. I'd
Yeah.
put that on his truck and figure out where he's hunting.
Yeah. Well, this has been interesting. The pronghorn is a fascinating animal.
Yeah.
Colter, Chitwood, Oklahoma State University. Richie had a great time out there. This
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a fun project. It's been really cool. Just we're still in the middle of finding out their research, and it's fun to be and
Part of that.
part of the results and to see what they come up with, and then but also the other projects that Colter's got going on, and potentially if we're lucky enough to tag along on those as well.
Yeah, he's a busy young guy.
Did you fly in the helicopter, Reggie?
No, I let Owen fly.
in his flip-flops,
so one of the
flying
questions I was going to ask Colter, it was a little different than the ones research we've done in the past, where they let us jump right in the helicopter with them and stuff. Yeah, but so they weren't these weren't as big either.
Oh,
so,
the helicopters.
Yeah. So
Well, it should have been you instead of Owen then.
well, yeah, I let Owen. He said he'd never done it, and I've done it. I've flown a helicopter a few times with a camera. So
Owen shows up out there with
In a blizzard
Yeah,
with flip flops on.
with flip-flops
shorts.
and
I'll
t-shirts.
be honest. I've filmed a lot of different places, and I've been cold. I've been cold, but I was cold out there, and just out there in Oklahoma, that wind, it
Ain't
was
nothing to
biting.
stop it. Yeah,
there was nothing to
Eating
stop it.
you up. Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
I tell you, some of the best duck hunting I've ever done is in Oklahoma. It was unbelievable.
Well, was that dry land hunting too?
Yeah.
But was it peanut?
Yeah, they were landed in peanut fields. We were hunting on a reservoir, but the way we found the ducks was the dust. Coming up from the peanut fields, they were feeding like that. It was wild. Of course, I was from Mississippi, and they're like, "We're going mallard hunting." I'm like, "What are y'all talking about? Y'all don't know nothing about mallards." But it was awesome, that's for sure.
Yeah, we filmed some DU hunts and peanuts out in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Same thing.
You can slam them. We need to go out there.
Yeah, I'd love to do that.
It's an air tag, by the way.
Air
Oh,
tag.
there we go.
Okay.
Apple pod, air tag.
You're close. You're closer than I was.
Close enough.
All right, guys. Well, look, we've been
All
going
right.
for a long time, so I know everybody's got a lot to do. Appreciate y'all being in here. We appreciate. I don't know if anybody's left on listening, but we appreciate y'all listeting to this podcast. So
Yeah,
much.
and Dudley, I think we're going to add a little bit of stock to the nursery coming up.
Okay.
But yeah. So just get ready. So hopefully some trees will be available pretty soon. And don't forget your food plot seed. We got a lot of free shipping promotions going on. Final forage, deer radish, spring protein pea. It's not too late to get your peas in the ground. And of course, endurance radish.
Yeah, that's right. Check out plantbiologic.com. Follow us on social media.
Yeah.
But
Not me.
Look, and if you don't mind, share I'd love for guys to share this podcast with some of their friends.
Yeah.
That would be very
That'd
helpful.
be nice.
To us.
That'd be
Give
really
us a
nice.
review.
Yeah.
And follow us on social media. So
We're not giving away anything out of Toxic Closet anymore.
I didn't have a chance to go get anything.
Okay,
out.
we'll dig around there later.
Yeah.
All right,
for
sounds
sure.
good.
I
Yeah.
think he'll be gone
He's
this
gone
afternoon.
tomorrow, so I'm
Oh,
gonna,
we're in.
Yeah.
All right, sweet.
All right, guys, it's been a lot of fun. I want to go antelope hunting now.
Yeah. Let's spend some time in
Let's
Oklahoma.
do it.
Sounds like we need to make a route through there, you know? Do a few things
we
over
do.
there.
Yeah, we do.
Cool.
And Richie, seriously, we need to find out when he's doing that wolf research in Alaska and get you plugged into that.
I'm going if you're going on that one.
Yeah, as long as he lets us tag along, we'll be on it.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, guys. Well, why don't you say goodbye, Dudley?
Goodbye, Dudley.
Get us out of here, Richie.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Gamekeeper Podcast, and be sure to tune in again. Subscribe to Gamekeeper Farming for Wildlife magazine, and don't miss the Mossy Oak Properties Fistful of Dirt podcast with my good buddy, Ronnie Cuz Strickland.